Is that improve grazing distribution. So grazing systems, fencing, wide growing. So again, from the NRCS conservation practices, those are the kinds of effects that could happen. What we don't know if those are simultaneously improving soil health, and if you can look at all the things that have been talked about already today, and say, if all those questions I asked earlier, if you improve soil health, what does that mean in terms of what the ranch uses in the economics? So it's real difficult to tease out those causes, and it's even more difficult to tease out which part of soil health is having that impact. And as Jay talked about, if you're going to go out and monitor, what should you be monitoring to get an idea of what's changing, what's causing an impact. So Holly Dyer standing in the back, she's going to answer all your questions because I apologize, I do have to leave as soon as I'm done talking and get to Torrington, but I'll be back tonight and for the rest of the meeting if you want to visit a little bit more. So Holly did a thesis, finished up her master's thesis not long ago, looking at how ranchers' profitability improved through forage production on private rangeland, looking at soil health. As I said, we work with NRCS pretty closely and other soil scientists trying to figure out what sort of relationships we could put in the model that would get at this. And we started asking them, so what does it look like? You know, if I draw a graph, what does it look like? So Holly looked at two different, what we call functional forms, and I'll show you these in a second. A linear response function and what's sigmoid or logistic growth function has two different forms. And then we also asked, so how long does it take? Well, that was an even bigger guess. So Holly looked at 35 years and 105-year response times to get from a degraded soil state to a potential soil state. And then, knowing that 105 years is a long time to look at things, 35 years might be a generation on a ranch, so it's more of a management type length of decision making. She looked at a different starting point within the longer response function. So, what does that response function look like? So these are the two different types of relationships that she looked at. So time, 35 years, that's supposed to be 105, not 135. Okay. And so looking at soil health, conceptually, if you start at a degraded state, you could move to what's potential on a site in 35 years or 105 years, and it looked like one of these sorts of graphs or lines. Probably the sigmoidal one is how it would work. Again, the soil scientists can't really tell us at this point. Maybe they can. Depends. Depends. Now he sounds like an economist. And you know, whether it takes 35 years, 105 or 135 years, why does that matter in terms of the economics? So time becomes a real important factor from an economic standpoint. If any of you work with bankers and start talking about, you know, 30-year mortgage, you pay your interest rate, and you know, pay a lot of interest over time. Time matters when we start talking about economics. Really, and the way it was explained to me years ago by my professor was, if you have a positive interest rate that you're paying on money, after about 30 years, it really doesn't matter. You're adding pennies to the return. So the income you get now and towards today counts a lot more than the income you're going to get 100 years from now. Basically the way it works. But the question that we're trying to get at here is, when do you change management to address or to make investments in improving your soil. You wait until it's fully degraded down here and then say, oh crap, I gotta do something. I'm not getting a quarter of the forage production that I was before. I need to do something. Do you wait that long? Or do you pick some intermediate time, and Holly, again, 105 is supposed to be here, so you have that 35-year time frame. Or do you do it earlier when you first start noticing a decline in soil health or forage production as kind of an indicator of that, and make your investment here? You're not going to get the kinds of, if this was possible and you're able to wait, you're not going to get the kind of return, the increase in production you would at the time you make the management change, or when you start noticing it at this point, than if you waited till it got down here. But the amount you're going to have to invest to go from here to here is probably a lot more. So I put some caveats in here of what I'm talking about. If you improve forage quality or quantity in any given season of the year, doesn't mean you're going to improve your ranch. Right? You have to be able to use that forage for something. And again, the model does this balancing supply of forage with demand from the herd for that same forage. The basic premise that a lot of the economic models, I think, miss is that those cattle have to be somewhere every day of the year. You have to provide the feed, water, and all the other amenities to that herd. Should be obvious to everyone in here, but a lot of the talks I give, it's not. They look at, if I'm working on public land, working with BLM, Forest Service, they only think about what happens in that grazing season on the permit. And if you cut the permit, well, it's just cutting that season. Well, you have to rebalance your whole forage supply through the whole year to address that. So we look at what substitute feeds are available in each season of the year as these sorts of management changes happen. So the model itself really only looks at the private benefit of these sorts of forage production, forage availability. And we know from a lot of other work that there's a lot of other values that get affected by improving productivity on rangelands. Things like wildlife habitat. What's the value to society of reducing erosion? Well, there's lots of things. If you're talking about municipal water, there's less water treatment costs. Talking about reservoirs, there's going to be less or longer life for the reservoir, those kinds of things. What's the value of a soil microbe? No one's even asked that question yet in terms of soil health. But as Pete was saying, I think it was Pete was saying, a lot of the medicines have been developed from soil microbes. And so there is certainly some value, and probably lots of values we don't even know about. And then what's the value of society knowing that rangelands are being properly managed? And then no question at this point. So some of the conclusions from all of this is if you're going to make if you're going to use soil health as an indicator, it's probably better to address things earlier than later. And I liken it to, does anyone have invasive species on their property in here? So I remember years ago when I first started my career, I was sitting down with a Forest Service guy, an economist, and he said, why aren't any of you guys working on the economics of invasive species? My response was, well, you're not giving us any money to do it. But really it was because they were just starting to show up in the West. And other than cheatgrass has been here for a long time. But a lot of other invasive species were just starting to show up. And so there wasn't an economic impact on landowners, or on cities, or recreationists, or any of that. And so there wasn't that demand. And so the agencies at that point weren't willing to make the investments in controlling invasive species. And we all know what happened in the last 30, 40 years, right? Okay, they just exploded. If we could have treated them at that point, we might have been able to avoid the issues that we're dealing with now. Same thing with soil health. Remember that sigmoid curve. If you treat it or you make your management change when you first start noticing differences, and I don't know what you're going to measure to notice those differences, but something.
Tiny little gum.
Yeah, tiny little clumps. Become a podologist, I guess. Okay. But as soon as you start noticing those, you ought to be addressing them now. Don't wait till you get to the bottom of that curve is kind of the point of that. The value of time is important. Again, if you can get a response in 30 years as opposed to 100 years, it means a lot more. It will avoid those losses as well. We do need a lot more research. All the things that the people earlier this morning were talking about, all those questions I asked, and hundreds more that I could think of. What does that response curve look like? What are you going to measure? How does soil health respond to different management scenarios? And we don't know that. How do you measure soil health and relate it to management decisions? Some of what Jay talked about. I just want to close with a couple other studies that we're doing at UW, and I'm sure there's a lot more. These are just ones that the Sustainable Rangelands Roundtable is doing. It's being funded by NRCS.